So, as we've talked about previously, large media conglomerates have increasingly been trying to develop global markets for their media products. Disney, when Disney releases The Avengers, it wants people around the world to watch that film. Now, these Western and American media companies have been very successful in developing these global markets for their media products. However, some critics have argued that one consequence of this global market for media products has been what's referred to as cultural imperialism. Right? Here, the worry is that increasingly American-style TV shows, films, popular music, and fashion are increasingly becoming dominant throughout the world. All right, and that people in all other regions of the world, Latin America, Asia, Europe, Africa, that people in other countries are increasingly paying attention to and consuming American-style media content rather than locally produced content. So the argument here is that in Indonesia or Thailand or Brazil, people are preferring to watch Hollywood-style films rather than films made by producers and directors in their own country. And some critics argue that this is leading to the collapse of people's own indigenous native culture, and that local media producers in other countries are finding it increasingly difficult to compete with these larger media conglomerates that are promoting and distributing this American-style media content. All right, so that in any kind of contest between a television show produced by Time Warner and a local TV show produced by a local Thailand producer, the Time Warner production is always going to win because the TV shows or films produced by these larger media conglomerates have special effects, big name actors, really superior production style that just cannot be competed with. All right, and also the argument here is that these larger media conglomerates will essentially dump their media products on these other countries for additional profit. Right, that typically Time Warner, when it's producing a new film, releasing a new film, it may already make back the cost of that film through ticket sales and revenues domestically in the U.S. So everything that Time Warner makes off that film internationally is just kind of like icing on the cake, so that it can afford to market and distribute that really expensive film in another country for a very limited cost, right? And it can undercut the prices for locally produced media. And then again, this makes it difficult for the local producer to compete. So the question here is whether or not these media products that promote American-style views and ideas are increasingly crowding out media produced locally in these other countries. And it raises questions about what the ultimate impact of this is in other societies. Now, when it comes to this concept of cultural imperialism, there is a big debate in the academic research and more generally in society over whether or not this cultural imperialism is indeed occurring. And there's a debate over, whether or not the export of American media products internationally is ultimately a good or a bad thing. All right. Now, the advocates of these media conglomerates and their supporters would say that it is really desirable for American-style TV shows and films and news media to be distributed internationally and globally, because it opens up others' societies, that it expands the range of ideas and views that are presented in these other societies, and it may encourage people in other countries to be more thoughtful, more skeptical, more questioning of their government leaders. Right here, the argument is that you've got a lot of countries that are pretty authoritarian, totalitarian, that suppress dissent and so on. Well, when American news media and films and TV shows winds up being introduced to authoritarian countries like the People's Republic of China or Iran, does that encourage citizens in those societies to be more, more open-minded, more willing to question and challenge their government leaders, right? So supporters argue that this is all a good thing. Another argument that supporters make is that when these large media conglomerates develop global markets for their media products, it fosters what Marshall McLuhan, the academic theorist, referred to as a global village. All right, that when we're all watching around the world, we're all watching the same TV shows and films, we're all watching CNN, we're all listening to Beyonce, that creates a kind of a global community of people where we share the same culture, we share the same ideas, and we're better able to communicate with one another. Now, critics of this whole process really challenge the development of global markets for media products, and again argue that part of what happens here is that these Western media companies are essentially just dumping their products in other societies, which undermines the native cultures. That as people watch, American TV shows and films, they spend less time paying attention to their own culture, and that the argument here is that ultimately this leads to an erosion of one's own native culture, and especially for the young. Young people may particularly be entranced by Western media and more willing to cast off their own native culture and traditions. And some critics have argued that this has led to a real kind of emerging schism or gap between young people in other societies that are much more Americanized and their parents and older generations that still stay true to one's own culture. So again, real questions about how this all plays out on the international stage. What do you think about this concept of cultural imperialism? And is this global market for media products developed by these media conglomerates, is it ultimately a good or a bad thing, do you think? I mean, what's your take on this? So, when we look across the media landscape today and survey the kinds of media produced by these larger media conglomerates, Some critics argue that the content of a lot of media is pretty superficial, pretty trivial stuff, that there's a lot of media attention to the Kardashians or Justin Bieber and his monkey and similar tabloid fare, and that some critics argue that there's not a lot of attention in media to some of the really tough, difficult issues that we have to face as a society. Healthcare, war, the Middle East, public education, the environment. Some argue that the media owned by these larger conglomerates avoids these very difficult yet important topics in favor of lots of really superficial content. And some argue that this focus on the trivial and the superficial distracts the American public and discourages people in our society from addressing more difficult political and social issues that we do need to address in our society. Some critics also argue that, as we mentioned before, that these larger media conglomerates don't really address issues related to our economy, ownership of media. That we see television, news organizations not really address those kinds of issues. As we've talked about before, is that in part due to a conflict of interest? Does CNN at Time Warner or ABC, owned by Disney, do those news organizations avoid addressing issues of corporate ownership of media because it's not in their interests to do so? Throughout this chapter, we've addressed the move towards greater concentration of ownership of our media and some troubling concerns about that. And this is something that you're going to have to, I think, sort out for yourself to see whether or not these criticisms are fair, warranted, and legitimate. There are political groups and consumer groups that are out there that are challenging these larger media conglomerates and trying to encourage them to act in more responsive ways. These groups are also calling for greater public oversight of media conglomerates and their activities because these groups argue that larger media conglomerates are not simply another media sector, but rather they're the lifeblood of our democracy, that our democracy depends upon media covering important social issues so that we as American citizens are informed about what is going on in society and able to make reasoned decisions about what politicians we want to vote for, what government policies we want to support. And some of these groups argue that if these larger media conglomerates aren't doing their job to inform us, well, then that leads to problems down the road for democracy. So what do you think about some of these arguments that these social groups and social movements make? Do they seem legitimate to you? Is their critique a reasonable one? So some things for us to think about.